Welcome back to another episode of the H3X podcast, where your hosts, Mark Goering and Dave Miller, we discuss the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. We're again trying out live Substack. Mark said that somebody might be waiting with bated breath, and we just admit you're going to be super disappointed if you were. We've been having a conversation, and I am got the honor of two giants in the faith. Mark, you get to hear from all the time. We've had Chuck on before, but Chuck Wood down in San Antonio has been instrumental both in Mark and I's life, not only as a movement model, a movement leader model, but as a father in the faith in many ways. And Chuck, I can just remember years and years and years ago, just it being on your living room, being on phone calls and asking questions and just being super frustrated. And then you laughing and saying, "Oh, yeah, I did that once. Don't do it like that." And so we were like, hey, let's jump on a call. And in a lot of ways, we're going to come back and go over the years of doing movement style leadership. What are some of the key takeaways and lessons that we've learned? And one of those surrounds contribution and collaboration and the heart posture that's required in order for us to be good kingdom citizens, where we are taking all of the things that the Lord has entrusted to us and making sure that those are at the complete disposal both of Christ and his church. So, just to tee it up quick, you made a statement on a Substack response where you said, I'm more interested in movement than I am movements. Why don't you unpack that phrase a little bit for us? And then we're just going to jump in.
Yeah, I was telling the guys before we started, this is more a public confession of my weaknesses and character flaws than, I'm not trying to sharpshoot anybody else. And I don't care what words you're using, but for me personally, when I started this journey over 15 years ago now, I was so fired up about starting a movement that, and I think it was well intended and good motives, but as things played out, and I didn't see the results that everybody was talking about, I kind of got disillusioned. And disillusionment is a dangerous place to be because you feel like you got sold a bill of goods. And when you start thinking you got sold a bill of goods by not only people, but by God, you're in a very, very dangerous place. And God had to work and massage my attitudes and expectations. And I finally came to the conclusion I'm a part of the movement that Jesus started over 2,000 years ago. And I'm very happy to be a part of that. So that's been my journey in a nutshell.
So, if you were to go back over the years, when did this moment of what that last phrase that you said, where I'm a part of movements and the disillusionment turned into what you just described, how far into your journey and what are some of the key things that you remember that really transitioned your heart out of that I've been sold a bill of goods, disillusionment kind of posture, heart questions to what you're thinking now?
Yeah, we first have to start with a divine surgeon doing, he's got a scalpel out and he's digging into that character. My first indicator was, hey, I've shared the gospel thousands of times. Where's the beef? Uh, I'm not leading scores of people to Christ, but I'm being faithful at sharing the gospel. Mm-hmm. And then a friend of mine, Andrew, posted this statement on Facebook. It was just a one-liner. Is this a movement of the gospel or the gospel of movements. Whew,
That'll
that
hit you.
yeah, that dug in pretty deep. And at first I was like, how dare you? You know, and then the Holy Spirit gets a hold of that and starts working. And then when Steve Smith passed away of liver cancer, that was a huge blow to me. I considered him a mentor, a friend, and I was like, God, what are you doing? You're taking out one of the most strategic movement catalysts on the planet. Why? Why are you doing that? So, and that led to uh, a lot of questioning. And then I just completely burned out. I was working so hard to try to see a movement. I was out of gas. So that brought me to the edge of the cliff, so to speak. And then I could either fall off or re-engage with God and figure out what his plan was for my life rather than, pursuing my own. I don't know if that answered the question, but that's a lot. So,
Well, whatever Chuck has to say is, in my book, has become quite valuable because of the fact that I think your re-engagement with Christ has really become something that is a hallmark that personally I see. I'm pretty sure that Mark will shake his head yes to this, but it's really a hallmark that I've seen. If you guys haven't jumped onto Substack and caught his Kingdom Kernels, you ought to, because I think, Chuck, the thing that I see come out a lot is that you're just constantly going back to the Gospels, going back to the Word, going back to scriptures, and I'm gonna affirm my burnout moment was 2015. I don't have to go into all the details here, but I basically reached the same point that you did, right? You explained
mhm.
it in your way. I'll just say, yeah, I was there as well. Mark, what about you? Do you have kind of like that moment? Even you've been in New York now, gosh, almost 5 years. You're running up on it quick. What about you?
Yeah, I think I've had a few different stages of that. I think when I initially met you, Dave, and others in Oklahoma City, I was at the end of some of my own efforts within the model that I was in, and I was feeling pretty burned out on that. And so my solution was maybe if we put in some new methods and a new plan. And that got me a few years out of that. But yeah, I think there was a point I was talking with Chuck about this probably in after we had moved to New York, 2020, 2021. Probably it was in 2021. I don't have an exact finger on the pulse of that, but there was somewhere in there where I was similarly. I think part of the beginning of it was the outward signs of I'm trying to run, it's not working, I'm not seeing what I thought I would see. The heart stuff that Chuck's talking about was not even on my radar initially. Initially, it was just like, oh, yeah, we're not seeing the stuff. What do we need to do different? What do we need to apply different? The heart came later.
What do you think made the difference whenever Chuck said, are we going after uh, a movement of the gospel, or are we going after the gospel of movements? I was looking over at Mark's eyes and I saw him go, like, mm-hmm. Um, why does that phrase resonate with you as we're talking about this today?
Well, I want to be generous to start with. I think that idea of movements, from my understanding, emerged because we were trying to be good stewards of the Great Commission and seeing
Sure.
the gospel get to every people in every place. And so, how do you measure that? How do you track that? Well, we want to be good stewards. So we want to say, okay, over here, there's this hot spot. These guys are doing something that's starting to see some multiplication. There's a movement happening over here. Oh man, there's some guys over here. There's a movement. So I think it started from that place of trying to be good stewards, and maybe and maybe for others that is still how they think about it. But I think for me, I began to realize, especially, and if we're getting really honest today on Substack with our 10 listeners here, but um, I think for me, guys, I began to realize that yeah, this is a heart issue as Americans experiencing what's happening in other parts of the world, and trying to import methods. I think was part of it, but then also trying uh, to see something happen here to compare to what's happening there or whatever. And so I think that language of movements began to put into my mind compartmentalization in some ways, where this happens here, that happens there, and almost there's a probably a prideful piece to it, but also just kind of like a blockage in my thinking. So part of it was a heart issue, part of it was just a blockage in my thinking to like this is here, that's there, these are separate kind of thing.
Yeah.
Well, I'm going to pause for a second and say all three of us are still using and talking about constantly movement methods. I mean, Mark, every
Yeah.
single week we get on this podcast and we're talking about the head, heart, and hands of the multiplying church and our leaders. And so we're all three of us are firmly footed inside of what we would consider a movement community. Okay, so if we're talking about like this tension back and forth, but yet all three of us have landed on, we're still consider ourselves to be movement guys. Where does that solidarity come from? Chuck, what is it that kept you in whenever you started to see this distinction in your own heart? Why didn't you abandon ship, burn the house down, and become the prophet that tells everybody they're doing what's wrong again?
Yeah. First, let me piggyback on what Mark said. I'm eternally grateful to the authors and to the trainers that I've been under for the last 20 years. And it all started 45 years ago, where my mentor cast a vision, the promise of Abraham. And I'm sorry, but I've been radically wrecked by that promise ever since he shared it. And you know, we want to make our lives count for something for God. You know, when He brings us into the fold, it unleashes some very spiritual desires and ambitions the right way. And man, if God made this promise to Abraham, your descendants will be like the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Well, I, I want a part of that action, you know? And so I've been addicted to that promise ever since. And just because of my faulty thinking and character flaws in using movement in the wrong way for my advancement, for my personal achievement, doesn't undermine God's promises. He still wants us to be fruitful and multiply. It's just that he has to do a lot of work on the inner man in order to get us there. So
And so as we piggyback off of Mark what said, I know you wanted to get that thought out, and I'm really glad that you do. So I'm going to repose the question just to make sure that we get to work through it. We're still firmly in the movement camp. We're not
yeah,
prophets here trying to burn the ship down and tell everybody there's a new thing that you've got to go do. The irony of
yeah,
our conversation is that what we're saying is that we're not going to go looking after a new thing. The irony of the conversation is we're saying we actually need to become a new man, not find a new method, right?
Clarity.
Like it's not about the method, it's about what God is doing in our own hearts. And so what are some of the things that keep us firmly going? Man, we still 100% believe in the multiplicational reproduction thrust of the scriptures, of disciple making being something that is a movement of Jesus Christ. Still keeps us in that camp. But at the same time, what is that heart posture that goes, we're still strongly here, firmly, convictionally, still very movement in our mindset. But with this new heart posture, how do we then approach it where we don't become the prophet telling everybody we're wrong?
Yeah.
Instead, we what?
I think you're tossing it to me, right, Dave? So,
Either
uh,
one.
well, I'll share briefly, and then I think Chuck has more on this. But there are three words that come to my mind. I think I've shifted to I like so Guy Caskey's on the comments here. He's saying some good stuff. Maybe I'll read that in a minute. But Guy uses this term instead of tracking, we're stewarding, and I've begun to learn just the term stewardship is so helpful that I'm a steward in my local context here of what God is doing in his kingdom. I want to become a good steward. And that's good biblical language because that's how Jesus talks about in his parables, right? So we're on safe ground when we go that direction. But I want to be a good steward. And then the other two is from Dave, you talked about contribution and collaboration. And so I think those three places in my heart shifting to instead of catalyzing and building to stewardship and then contribution allows me to realize I'm adding, I'm contributing, but also it opens and my eyes to others are contributing to towards the work here, and I'm contributing to things there, and not just linear sequential. It's got to happen here and then there, but it's here, there, everywhere. That language of from movements to movement does that for me. So collaboration. And this last one is collaboration is where if I'm contributing to something and collaborating with others, I've got to get to that heart posture of what do I have to bring to the table, what do I have to receive from others as well. How about
Yeah.
you, Chuck?
I think number one, just take a look at Jesus's ministry, 3 years. Would it pass the test of a definition, our popular definitions, by the way, there are many, of a movement at the day of his resurrection? There's 120 after the resurrection and ascension in the upper room, 120 people. How many generations? Uh, you know, uh, it's really not that impressive. And in Corinthians, there's 500. This is the master disciple maker. In 3 years, this is what he has to show for it. Fast forward to 2026. Well, okay, that's pretty impressive. And it's a matter of perspective. What is God doing versus what am I doing? I want to join Jesus in his movement because that's his desire and his command.
Yeah.
If I focus on results, well, that tells you a lot about where my worship is. If I'm just focusing on obeying Jesus, now we've got something. So just going back to Jesus and seeing his ministry and his command helps me put things in perspective.
I I talk a lot. Mark has to hear me talk about this all the time, but I talk a lot about responsibility. Um, when I go, I'm going to take this really, really big conversation that we're having, and I'm going to narrow it down to a little bitty square, a little bitty speck in the grand scheme of things, which happens to be the business that I'm responsible for. If I look at that business as the leader, um, I have the responsibility to train and to equip my team to do their jobs and to contribute in their specific responsibilities in a way that allows everybody else's contributions in the business to interact in such a way that the outcome is the product that we create. And so what I mean by that is that somebody comes and drops off a piece of clothing. from the time that customer drops it off till the time that the customer picks it up, all that customer is doing is they're interacting with one singular person, and that is in their minds our business. Does that
Yeah.
make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And when they ask a question, they don't need to have five different conversations because they talk to five different people. When they talk to one person, they need to be able to get the same answer from the next person because we have to function as a unit.
Yeah.
So, like, our community of our business is a singular unit, and customers are not satisfied if they get multiple answers. They're only satisfied is if they have one conversation, regardless of the person that they're talking to. The reason I bring that up is just to simply say, like, that has been the framework for me that's helped me to understand what is it that Jesus is communicating to our world? And what is it that the kingdom of God is bringing? And it's like we have multiple different conversations that are going on. And I really want to get my heart so aligned with what the Father is up to through the image and the work and the model of Jesus Christ,
Mhm.
that when I speak and when I act, people should see and hear and understand the singular message of the Father's will, right? His desire for those things. I think if we all just kind of get to that understanding where we're going to go, okay, the more we are transformed in the image of Christ, both in heart, both in hands, and in head, I think the more that the singular message of the gospel, the
Mhm.
salvation that is available, becomes clear. And I realize that that seems like a massively huge pipe dream, but that's to me in my own heart, in my own perspective, when I start trying to control that and get other
Yeah.
people to get on board, that's when I start to mess up because
Mhm.
I'm going, Jesus is way better at that heart transformation than I am. And I also am not very good at trying to convince everybody how to be Christ like. All I can do is say, here's the model, here's the king, here's his kingdom. Let's go and listen to him and try to become like him. And I have to trust that those pieces are going to come together. And the irony for me is, and all of that is, I realize how little control that I have. And so that was kind of my big
Yes.
for me, that was my big pull out of the burnout mode is I was a control freak.
Yeah.
And as I'm trying to control God's work, I'm stepping into the place of the spirit and I don't have the capacity for that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I would not try to play the spirit. Guys, I'm a pretty high capacity guy. I don't have the capacity to run the entire strategic gospel movement for all of history to the end of time across the planet. I just can't
Right.
do that. And so that has to put me in position, Mark, to where I come back to what you said. I'm a contributor. That's all I can be, no matter how big or how important or how good I think I am at it. At the end of the day, I'm still just going to be a contributor. And I think I have to keep that perspective. How can I help? How can I serve? How can
Yeah.
I take the talent that's given me and make sure if I'm given five or I'm given two, that I multiply that? But I definitely don't want to be the one who goes, I buried it because I was scared I was going to mess up.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I think of a river, the river is the gospel, it's Jesus. And then there's all these little tributaries flowing into the river. The tributary doesn't say, I'm the reason the river exists. No, there's many tributaries flowing into the river. And the river is the main thing, but the tributary is important. All of us together are flowing into that river. And that's the body, that's the kingdom. It's all together. This really helps me appreciate um, different parts of the body. You
Yeah.
know, I,
Yeah.
I, I'm, I'm coming to a place, and I have to be reminded all the time. Hey, you're not all that and a bag of chips. You're just Chuck Woods, stay in your lane, do your thing, but everybody else is doing their thing.
Yeah.
So,
Well, I want to, uh, as I often do, Dave, in our dynamic, make a little just statement here of just how this is hitting me. We talk about on this podcast about the head the heart, the hands of the multiplying church, and our leaders. And the reason why is because each of those things matters, but they're all connected. And so, one of the things I realize in this conversation, and again, this is like confessional, is that I think language is descriptive, but it also shapes us. And one of the things I've realized in this conversation is how much um, the things that I repeat and I say begin to out of my mouth begins to shape my heart, begins to shape my head and my hands for the ways that I'm open to that collaboration and contribution of others. And so I think in the last few years, as I've gotten around different guys that use language like Chuck is talking about, emphasizing Chuck all the time brings it back to where do you see that in the ministry of Jesus? So getting back to the simple model of Jesus, and then using language like movement versus movements. It's small, but these things actually matter because it shapes my heart's posture and then my ability to see what God is doing and join Him in it. So I guess I would put that out there of being careful with the words that come out of our mouth. And I don't know what everybody means by which word they use, but being careful with that because it shapes the rest of us.
Yeah. I think I've got all these pictures in my head. I think of one mountain, there's a glacier, and then there's an avalanche that starts. What's the speed of the avalanche? Well, it's an incredibly powerful, fast moving thing. What's the speed of the glacier? In inch a year. But over the years, that glacier carves out huge valleys. So when we're talking about contributions, okay, some are avalanches, some are glaciers, but it's all the same mountain, and all of it is movement. And maybe, just maybe, the avalanche was started by the last snowflake, one single snowflake that hit the ground.
Yeah.
And that's what started the avalanche. So, again, contribution. We all have a contributing factor in the movement.
And I hear in our conversation something I think all three of us, for anybody who listens to this or comes across it, is to say, um, whatever kingdom responsibility the king of the entire cosmos has given you matters,
Yes.
Yes.
regardless of what anybody else says, thinks, sees, understands. Like if we pause, I was before we got on this morning, I was in the book of Daniel, and that weird story where God turns him basically into a werewolf because he wouldn't acknowledge that he wasn't the king of all things. He sends him out into the field, he grows hair and claws and for 7 seasons of a time, right? And then he says he comes to his senses, and then says, no, God is the glorious God. And Daniel makes the statement, God can put any man in a kingdom.
Mm.
That God sets the governments. And if he wants to move you on, he can do that. And he does. And he sets anybody that he wants to in the kingdom. If this is the God that we're serving, that he can take the most powerful nation in the world, the most powerful king in the world in ancient history, and dethrone him in an instant by saying, okay, your time is up, and then moving him back to becoming the most powerful man whenever he desires. Then if he comes to me and says, this is my will for you and what I want you to contribute,
Yeah.
that has to matter. Like, and if we lose that perspective, we're going to start competing very, very quickly. But if we understand that he is specifically designed and called us to something, we're going to trim those wicks as the virgins who are waiting for his arrival, and we're going to make sure that whatever corner of the vineyard he gives us, we're going to make sure that the grapes in that vineyard are cared
Yes.
for, right? So that when he shows up, we have something to give, because that matters. And I hear, in our conversation. So if anybody's listening to this, just to come back and to say, man, don't worry. That comparison, there's a reason that it was in the 10 Commandments. Man, it is a reason that he said, do not covet in the top 10, because it will eat your soul to death.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think of another passage, Psalm 46. We usually use this for, hey, you're working too hard, slow down. It says, cease striving and know that I'm God. I will be exalted among the nations. I will be exalted in the earth.
Yeah.
That is a movement verse. And I don't think it's saying don't work hard. I think it's saying, hey, have the right posture. I'm going to do this. You steward what you're being given, and then the Father, Son, and the Holy Spirit are going to make this happen, not you. So it's a
Well,
great reminder.
I know we're wrapping up, and I wanted Chuck to have the last word there, but I got to respond to that because that was what was going in my heart. Is I think on the other side of we all were confessing earlier on in this podcast that different ways that we've gone into burnout, and on the other side of that, for me, on the other side of that, I feel peace and I feel a greater degree of trust in the Lord's. For me, I think it's Psalm 16 that says the boundary lines have fallen for us in pleasant places, and I have come to just a greater degree of trust in my contribution without a need to compare or say it's better than, it's different than, it's whatever than, but coming to I mean, that's been a shaping work, but getting more to that place of saying I trust God that he has given me an assignment, he shaped me for that assignment, and I can just rest in it and contribute it without needing it to be a certain thing. And so then on the other side of all of that striving piece that Chuck is talking about, that really resonates. I feel a great degree of peace and
Yeah.
just ability to say, all right, Lord, let your will be done.
Yeah. Yeah.
So we started this podcast off with working through what is the difference between, as we talk about movement and movements. It was a phrase that kind of just kicked off the entirety of the conversation. We asked Chuck to come on. He was very gracious to do it. And so, as we finish up this conversation, like Mark said, we'd love for you to have the last word. Chuck, what is it that is in your heart, like as we're finishing up this conversation, that kind of communicates the idea behind everything we've been talking about?
Yeah, I would say that if you're making disciples and the Great Commission Jesus has given us has gripped your heart and you're beady eyed, fang bearing, foaming at the mouth, ready to do this thing, just pause and realize that it's in the strength of the Lord that this is going to happen. Keep reminding yourself of this daily. It's a promise, and lo, I will be with you always, even to the end of the age. So Jesus is with you, regardless if it's going slow, fast, fruitful to the nth degree, or you got one guy, Isaac, and he is going to be the generations to match the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Trust him as you're doing this.
It's good stuff. Guys, thanks for joining us. We'll hop on. See y'all next time.
Thanks, guys.